Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar on Sudan, the crisis and the violence that the Sudanese people are actually experiencing. So I'm Professor Nirmala Gopal from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Department of Criminology and Forensic Studies. We all know, or we all may know, that issues around violence against women is quite a controversial topic, whether it's in South Africa, Brazil, India, Russia, China, Africa, countries in Africa. We do know that different forms of violence have undermined the role of women in various parts of the world. Of course, we also understand that some countries may have higher levels of violence in comparison. Some countries may have higher levels of violence in comparison to other countries, and violence can come in different forms and different shapes. There's structural violence, there's institutional violence, there's physical violence, sexual violence, etc. Now, today's panelists, who are an expert group, an expert scientific group of panelists, are going to be provoking our thinking around violence against women, and specifically sexual violence against women, that are currently being perpetrated in Sudan as a consequence of the conflict between the army and a paramilitary group called Rapid Support Forces. Now, because of the conflict or the tensions that are actually being experienced between these two groups, research, the United Nations have alerted us to the fact that violence against women is being perpetrated in Sudan. Of course, there are other forms of violence, but our focus for today is the violence against women that is being perpetrated within the Sudanese context. Now, the reason we decided that this would be an interesting topic for us to engage with is because it is current. It is also a country located in Africa. And we do know and understand that in Africa at the moment, we want to see development. We want to see the sustainable development goals being achieved. And unless we have peace and stability, the group of panelists here believe that it will be very difficult to obtain sustainable development in terms of economics, in terms of the social and political stability that we all seek to attain. So with that, I want to say a huge and warm welcome to all our participants. Our panelists, especially, a very warm and special welcome for taking time off their busy calendars. I know in Brazil, where Dr. Sandra Paulson hails from, it's, I think, about 7:30 a.m. So we want to thank you for waking up so early and making yourself available. Where Dr. Ruchita Berry hails from, which is India, it is now approximately 4 in the evening, in the afternoon. So we want to thank you also for extending your work a day. Then we have Ms. Oliswa Zulu, who's part of corporate relations, who's giving us her moral support. And our final panelist, Ms. Bukiwe Biela, who is from UKZN, a PhD student who has a keen interest in the discourses around violence and violence against women. Now, first speaker for today is Dr. Sandra Paulson, who has worked extensively in the field of development, in the field of economic development, but who has also dabbled in the field of women, peace, and security. She comes from IPEA, which is a think tank based in Brazil. And we are actually extremely honored and privileged to have her share her wisdom with us today on a topic that is so critical and crucial for all of the globe. With that, I want to hand over to Dr. Sandra Paulson to lead the discussion and debate on women, violence, peace and security in Sudan. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Paulson.
Dr. Paulson, sorry, you are muted.
Sorry. I start over again because it seemed that I didn't turn on my microphone. So good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues from the University of Natal and my colleague Rushita Berry from India, and my now colleague Bukiwe Biela, and all of you that are here listening to us. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to be able to talk to you all during this day. It's early morning for us here in Brasilia, but the issue of women, peace and security is a very important agenda if we think about our developing countries, our societies that are on their way to development. And the issue of violence in any country all over the world should be of concern for all of us, since the world is becoming smaller and smaller, and we all know what's going on about women and women participation in different societies. And right now, our focus is in Sudan. We know that the violence against women has been increasing, and it's been a few years now that different organizations are trying to call the attention to what's going on. And what I would like to do is to maybe put this situation in the context of the international process that has been going on about women, peace and security, especially since the Beijing conference, the World Conference on Women in 1995. Since then, the issue of women and armed conflicts, either international as domestic conflicts, has been put on the table for discussion by the international community of the states of the United Nations. So it's very important that we pay attention to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 from the year 2000 that introduced just this issue of women, peace and security as an important issue for us to care for if we really want to have development in our societies. So what is going on in Sudan right now is something that we can observe probably in all of our countries, where women are the most vulnerable part of our societies, and they have been subject to violence, both internationally when we are talking about war conflicts between nations, but also in conflicts in nations, like it's happening now in Sudan. So what the experience of Brazil shows is that these conflicts, they are somehow a reflection of the women condition in our societies. So it's very important that we start looking at the different aspects of the female participation in society to try to understand why we are the most common victims of these conflicts, even though we hardly ever start a conflict ourselves. So what Brazil's experience has shown is that as long as the women participation and women condition in society improves in the country, then we also get a better participation in these peace processes all over the world. So Brazil experience since the 80s is that we have started to put the issue of human rights, female rights, women's rights into the public policy agenda. And that has evolved to a situation where nowadays Brazil has an action plan for working with these issues, and we are making small but advances, progress in this agenda. And what I think we should do as countries in this community of nations is to support our fellow women in their fight, in their struggle for more evidence and for the end of this violence through cooperation and through putting available what we know about these processes for all of us to help put pressure either on governments or on these like groups in conflict, so we can get something to improve in those countries. So right now, I think these declared or undeclared armed conflicts that include organized crime in our cities and in countryside, or attacks against women defenders of the environment or of the rights of native people. I think all of these we have to include in our discussions. So the questions that I'd like to put on the table just for us to start the discussion is, how can we avoid these conflicts and this violence against women in Sudan and in our own countries also? How can we put pressure on the government to really include these issues as human rights issues, as it is in the United Nations chart? And how can we do to help our fellow women in all these countries around the world that are still suffering these conflict situations? I don't know if that's enough to start with, Nirmala, or if you'd like me to go more into detail in the Brazilian situation, but I think that's what I wanted to start saying so we can start the debate.
Thank you, Sandra. Now, I'd like you to, if you are comfortable, can you please go a little further into the Brazilian situation? Thank you.
Okay. The thing is, since the UN Decade of Women, 1975 to 1985, we in Brazil have approved very many different pieces of legislation to improve women's rights in our society. So in August 1985, we had the creation of the first National Council on Women's Rights at the level of the federal government, including a lot of civilian representatives. Already in 1985, we created in the state of São Paulo the first women's police station, where women victims of violence could go and be treated in a different way by people who were capacitated and who had knowledge to know how to be a good receptor of these claims and complaints from women in our society. And this opened up a whole new world for women in Brazil, those that were victims of intrafamiliar violence and even violence on the streets and things like that. Already in 1988, we passed the new federal constitution with clauses that included gender equality and women's and human rights as main clauses. So equal rights between men and women are in the Brazilian constitution, protection of women in the labor market and of women's rights to reproduction, for example, and rights and obligations within wedlock were clarified and made simple so that women and men could really have the same status in a relationship that was recognized by law. Then in April 1995, for the first time in Brazil, it was prohibited to require a no pregnancy certificate or a sterilization medical certificate for women applying for a job. This is very important because we all know that the fact that women can get access to the labor market, can get their own income, that is basic for making progress in the female situation, in the women's rights in our society. Then in 1997, for the first time, it was required, legally required by political parties to have a quota of at least 30% of women candidates to the legislative bodies in the country. Then in May 2001, for example, the crime of sexual harassment was included in our criminal code. And this is also very important because many women are subject to sexual harassment and they didn't have where to base their complaints. So now since May 2001, there is this law 10,224 that recognizes sexual harassment as a crime. Then since 2003, it was the creation of the Special Secretariat for Policies for Women. And even though there have been changes in different governments, it has been maintained some kind of institutional arrangement for taking into consideration women as a main focus of different public policies. Then in 2006, it was passed a law called Maria da Penha. Maria da Penha is the name of a woman that was almost murdered by her husband because of domestic violence. And she resisted and somehow she got to get out and ask for help. And since then, there is a law that is preventive and protective with measures also for rigorous punishment of intrafamiliar violence in Brazil. Then since 2014, the Brazilian government decided to go into this agenda of women, peace and security with more emphasis. And we passed the first national action plan that came out of a working group, an interministerial working group that passed the plan of action for the government, consolidating this agenda of women, peace and security as a very important agenda for governmental policy making. So that's the evolution that we have observed since the 1980s in Brazilian society, with new laws being passed almost every year, making progress in this situation of women in conflicts and victims of violence, even at home. This National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, it ends this year, 2023, and right now the Brazilian government is working in a new version of this new plan that is required, because the question is, how can we have peace in our societies if women are still victims of violence, even in their own families? Most of the violence that women complain about in our societies come from men that they have known for many years, men that they have relationships with. So as far as I know, this is also the situation in Sudan, where there are societal ritual, societal culture that opens the possibility of men to make women their victims in these, even in situations of no conflict. And now, as Sudan is in conflict, internal conflicts, it's even worse, the situation there. So what Brazilian experience says is that it can take time, it might take time, but we have to start introducing and mainstreaming the issue of violence against women in the public policy domain.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulson. Am I assuming that that's the end of your presentation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to listen to what others have to say, and also then starts the debate or the discussion, so we can get into more specific questions and maybe answer different interrogations that we might have in the group.
Wonderful. I'm sure we all welcome that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to me.
You are most welcome. And I think what was really interesting is that you first set the scene in terms of what the United Nations obligations are, as far as maintaining or facilitating peace and security across the globe. And then I think was really also valuable is the fact that you used the situation of Brazil and gave us some ideas on how those good practices can actually be imported into other countries, and Sudan, that is currently experiencing the kind of conflict that it is, could learn from these lessons. And I think the peacekeepers or the ambassadors of peacekeeping initiatives or conversations could learn from Brazil's experience in as much as they can learn from other countries. But I think for this specific webinar, they could learn from the experiences that Brazil has already undertaken and has seen some successes. So thank you very much once again, Dr. Paulson. At this point, I think it's appropriate for me to say that the collaborators in this particular webinar, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, the South African BRICS think tank, as well as the Department of Higher Education and Training, also welcomes all participants as well as panelists to this very important and informative conversation around violence generically, but also violence against women in Sudan specifically. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ruchita Berry, also an extremely experienced and well-versed academic and practitioner in the field of security studies. All of us would have seen in the brochure that she comes with a wealth of experience in terms of working with the military academy, but also outside of that in various parts of Africa. And I know she's quite a doyen in the African context. Dr. Berry, Dr. Paulson and I were recently together at the South African, it was the South African BRICS Academic Forum. And we participated in the same panel, and we heard some really interesting ideas that came through from Dr. Ruchita Berry as well. So with that, I want to hand over to Dr. Ruchita Berry. Thank you very much once again for making time to be with us. We're really looking forward to you provoking our thinking around women, peace, security, and the conflict that's currently happening in Sudan. Over to you, Dr. Berry.
Thank you so much, Professor Nirmala, for inviting me for this very important and timely discussion on the conflict in Sudan and the violence against women in Sudan, and how How do we deal with it? What has been the response? And the issue of women, peace and security, the women, peace and security agenda. So in my presentation today, I will be taking up 4 issues. First, I'll give you briefly a snapshot of the conflict in Sudan and how it's impacting the woman, particularly in terms of violence against women. Secondly, what is the UN peace and security agenda, especially with reference to violence against women. Third, I would look at India's role in and its contribution to women, peace and security agenda. And finally, look at the responses at various responses to the violence against women in Sudan. So these are the 4 areas that I'll be covering in my presentation today. So beginning with a brief snapshot of the conflict in Sudan. Sudan is a country in the Horn of Africa, and it's been in news for the deadly ongoing armed conflict, which began almost 2 months ago on 15th between the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan and the paramilitary forces led by the Rapid Support Group headed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo in a power struggle to control the country. Despite multiple announcements of ceasefire and Saudi Arabia and US-sponsored talks and IGAD initiative, which was launched only yesterday. I think there was an IGAD heads of government meeting for a political settlement, which has been rejected by the warring parties. And so the hostilities continue with dire consequences for the region at large. Over a month, there has been intense fighting going on in the national capital, Khartoum, twin cities of Omdurman and other parts of the country. The the Sudanese armed forces have been bombarding the RSF camps and strongholds in various parts of the country. More importantly, the violence has killed hundreds and displaced more than 1.3 million people. Within the country, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding with shortages in food, water, medicine, electricity, and fuel. What is alarming is the reports on gender-based violence, including sexual violence, that are surfacing, with the fact that the access to prevention and response services is severely limited in the country at the moment due to the ongoing fighting and the destruction and the looting of healthcare centers and hospitals. So the women are being subjected to sexual violence on a daily basis in Sudan. Women in central and northern Khartoum are facing a terrible reality of sexual violence at the hands of the RSF. Families are trapped in once safe homes, and now they are at mercy of these armed men, which has left women and girls vulnerable to assault. Now, the women in Sudan have taken up to social media on this issue, and they've said that the violence against women is nothing new, and that the warring groups are using rape as a tool of war. But they say that they have faced this before in Darfur, and we've been through this kind of situation before. So how do we deal with this unfolding situation of violence against women in Sudan? Now, the UN has set up an agenda to deal with women, peace, and security. And it is well known that violent conflicts disproportionately affect women and girls and intensify gender inequalities and discrimination. And the situation in Sudan is something which we have seen in other parts of the world too. Now, the UN, under the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, highlighted the need to engage more women in peacekeeping operations and also reaffirmed the role of women in prevention, management, resolution of conflicts and peace building. So the idea was to say that women are not just victims, they can also be leaders in the peace processes. So that they should be allowed to take a role, leadership role in conflict resolution and peace building. So in terms of the conflict-related sexual violence, there are provisions in the resolution 1325, which calls for all parties to armed conflict to take up special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse. Similarly, resolution 1960 of the Security Council calls upon parties of armed conflict to make and implement specific time-bound commitments to combat sexual violence. So now, and they also hold the perpetrators accountable for their deeds. Now, we will discuss as to what has been the response at the UN level and the regional organization level on the situation that is unfolding in Sudan. But I think while we are discussing the WPS agenda, it will be important to note that India has played a stellar role in the WPS agenda, specifically in terms of sending women in the UN peacekeeping missions. And this has been going on for a very long time, since the 1960s, when it deployed the first team of women from the Indian Armed Forces Medical Services to the UN peacekeeping missions. And it was the first country to contribute to the Secretary General's Trust Fund for Victims of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. It deployed the first ever all-female formed police unit in Liberia, which served for a decade. And it has also deployed a battalion in Congo and at the Abyei region, which is bordering Sudan and South Sudan. So India's efforts have been appreciated and recognized both by the host countries and by the UN. I recall President Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia saying that, we see you as a family, and if I had my will, I would have recommended that some other unit left Liberia and that the Indian formed unit continued to serve serve in Liberia. So that's a huge, applause for the work that the Indian women peacekeepers did in Liberia. So what I'm trying to do here is basically to give you an idea as to the fact that India has been in forefront in calling for first leadership role of women in conflict resolution, and second, that it has contributed at the UN Trust Fund for Victims Against Sexual Exploitation. So it has taken up both these roles very seriously. Now, coming back to the situation in Sudan and what has been the response. First, the response from the UN. In a statement issued by the UN Women Executive Director, Seema Bahos, she said that she expressed her grave concern over the conflict situation and also called all parties to ensure that no woman or girl is affected by these crimes, and that all actors to spare no effort to mitigate the increased risk. And she also said that that every instance of sexual and gender-based violence must be investigated and prosecuted without exception. I'm really happy to hear what she's saying, but I'm not really sure whether what she has said is being implemented in Sudan. Now, the second response that I'm going to discuss is from the African Regional Organization. So there was a virtual meeting which took place sometime in May, which was organized by the Peace for Sudan platform, and which involved the UN African Union's Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security. There were other important organizations represented in this, like the chairperson, the deputy chief of staff of the cabinet of the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, the former president, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kenya, the head of gender affairs of IGAD Secretariat, and also the Deputy Regional Director, East and Southern Africa of UN Women. And most importantly, the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was also part of this virtual meeting where they called for the end of conflict and highlighted the impact of women and girls. And they also called upon to mobilize support to women's peace building and protection efforts in Sudan. So this is what the regional organizations have been doing. But now I must turn my attention to the response of the Sudanese women. And here I underline and reiterate the fact that, we should not view women as just victims. And the Sudanese women have shown that, they are not just women, they are ready to lead and resolve their own problems, that they are going to find the local solutions for the local problems. And if you look at the history of Sudan, you find that women have played an important role in trying to prevent the conflict and advocate for peace and ending of wars in past. And this can be traced back to the 1950s. But in the recent past, Sudanese women played a crucial role in the 2019 revolution that overthrew the long-time authoritarian ruler, Omar al-Bashir. And women were at the forefront of protests. Their participation was very key in the success of the revolution. During the current conflict too, you find that the women have showed a leadership role and launched at least 6 initiatives that have come across to stop war, protest against the violence against women, and provide support to displaced women and men. And I can list some of these. They are Women Against War, a Woman Called to Resist War and Demand Its End Initiative, which is based in Kordofan, Mothers of Sudan, which is a network of around 50 women's organizations from all regions in Sudan. Then Ceasefire Initiative for Darfur, because Darfur is another region which has been deeply impacted by the violence against women. South Red Sea Organizations Initiative, the Daref Emergency Room, which is basically providing support to displaced families. So the women in Sudan are moving forward, taking up leadership roles. So in conclusion, I would like to suggest that in order to achieve sustainable development, in order to achieve the sustainable development goal of Sustainable Development Goal 16 in particular, which aims significantly to reduce all forms of violence and calls governments and communities to end conflict, insecurity, and also violence against women in particular. We should continue with all our efforts. The international community should continue with all our efforts to end the conflict in Sudan. And given the significant role that Sudanese women can play in peace building as well, as the grave consequences of conflict on women and girls and the entire Sudanese population, it is crucial that the international community continues to engage with women in Sudan to show solidarity and to expand and broadcast their voices and strategies and mobilize for their participation in finding a lasting solution, a lasting peace in Sudan. So I'll stop here. Over to you, Nirmala.
Thank you very much, Ruchita, for that very informative, insightful, and comprehensive interrogation of the role of women in the peacekeeping initiative in Sudan, as well as some of the impact of the conflict that women are experiencing. I think the take-home message for me here is the fact that you accentuated rather than attenuated the critical role that women can play in terms of building nations in conflict zones and how their voices are equally important to the mainstream conversation or discourse around peacekeeping initiatives. And the second take-home message for me is the role of women in terms of attaining Sustainable Development Goal 16 in as far as peace and justice and stable institutions are concerned. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Berry. But in addition to that, I want to also quickly comment on the role of the BRICS nations and their responsibility in as far as the violence that's taking place in Sudan is concerned. And I think we all are aware, or many of us may be aware, that there was a meeting of foreign ministers of the BRICS countries on 1st of June in South Africa, because South Africa is the current chair of BRICS. That, at 2023, South Africa became the chair for BRICS, which it will hand over next year to another of the countries. And at this meeting, the foreign ministers actually, what they said was that they expressed a great deal of concern at the outbreak of violence in Sudan. And I think that was a very important commitment and expression in terms of articulating their concern. In addition to that, they actually urged the immediate cessation of the hostilities that are currently occurring in Sudan. So we can see the role of BRICS and their voices in terms of not wanting these hostilities or conflicts to actually occur in any part of the world. But I think in Africa, they're concerned about regional trends of hostilities. But in addition, they called for the unimpeded access of the Sudanese population to humanitarian assistance. And we know that women who are vulnerable and children who are vulnerable, if they are not given access to humanitarian assistance, it leaves them in a, there's a double burden that's imposed on them. Besides the violence, whether it's sexual or physical, but also inaccessibility to humanitarian assistance. So with that, I want to thank you once more, Dr. Berry. And I'd now like us to move to Ms. Bukiwe Biela, who is not only an employee at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, doing really important work, humanitarian work, especially in the UKZN Foundation, but also a current PhD student in the discipline of criminology and forensic studies. So in her master's dissertation, she shared with us her results and her literature review on women and violence, which is a similar topic that she's taking up in her PhD thesis. And I think her role here today is to look at how women are disadvantaged at various levels. Although her master's thesis focused on women in South Africa, she's going to share with us how women globally, internationally, share similar or experience similar types of marginalization and violence. So with that, over to you, Ms. Bukiwe.
Thank you, Prof, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so interesting to listen and to hear what has been happening around the world in the fight against violence against women. The statistics are very impressive, and the policies that have been put in place, they are very impressive. So it's encouraging to see that governments across the world are working hard to alleviate violence against women. But I just want us to bring it down to the human level. You know, when we're listening to statistics and we're listening to policies, as individuals and as lay people who may not be in the sector of security, we tend to distance ourselves from the issue of violence against women. So my role in this is to bring us all in, to bring us back, to show that actually violence against women, it affects everyone in society, and it should be everyone's responsibility to do what they can in their capacity to fight violence against women. I'm going to share a presentation, but I'm going to be talking over just pointers actually for my talk. It's not long, it's just 5 slides, and I'll be done quickly. Let me just try to share screen. There we go. Sorry, what have I done? Oh, there you go. So just as an introduction, just to bring everyone back, you know, we live in a society that has normalized violence against women to the extent that we have become numb to it to a certain level as society, as individuals in the society. The normalization of violence in Africa has made communities to rather want to explain violence rather than to question and to fight it. We want to say, it's culturally acceptable. What was she wearing? What was she doing? Why did she provoke this? Why did she? No, we are more comfortable to questioning, and we are more comfortable to explaining violence because it puts us out of the question than to question and to fight it. But for this talk, I'm just going to highlight the impact of violence on not only the victim, but to the entire society. I just want to also highlight that abuse of any form, it is wrong and is a violation of basic rights. But violence against women, it's a major threat to economic development in a region like Africa, where Sudan is, where violence against women is widespread. It is an explicit manifestation of gender inequality and is increasingly being recognized as an important risk factor for a range of poor health and economic developmental outcomes. So we're going to look at the social impact, the health impact, and the economic impact imposed by gender violence on both the victims and the general society. Looking at the social impact, on the victim level, violence the individual level, victims of violence feel a sense of embarrassment emanating from self-blame for victimization, which may, in many circumstances, result in withdrawal from social activities and withdrawal from social participation. So not only is the victim suffering from, not only has they suffered from the incidences of violence, but it takes away the social cohesiveness of them participating in the community because they feel that they should isolate themselves. Because as you would know, if let's picture a victim of violence who's been battered, safe by their husband. We don't live in a society that welcomes, that is safe for people to come out because we ask questions, what happened? What did you do? So victims of violence, they are more comfortable to withdrawing from social activities. On a family level, children who are raised in families where a woman is abused are also victims of violence. They're not always victims physically, but they are always victims psychologically. What happens is that children who witness violence, they may form impression that such behavior is justified or is normal. In other words, they adopt violent norms. They are also brought up in a culture of violence that may negatively affect their self-development and ability to function in society. So that incident of violence that happened in that home that was private, that we may not even know about, it breeds a young person who's going to come and interact in a society that they don't know how to interact without being violent. And at a community level, gender equality, as we know, as the speaker just before me has alluded, it is central to safeguarding human rights. It is central to upholding the democracy and preserving the rule of law. Gender equality also implies equal access to and equal distribution to resources between men and women. So because GBV contributes to cultivating a heteronormative society and perpetuates power over women, it is a big threat to gender equality. The gender equality which we have fought so hard for and we're still fighting so hard for to attain is under big threat due to gender-based violence. Violence against women also has an it also has a health impact. It has the health consequences of violence can be immediate and severe, long-lasting and chronic, and they can be also fatal. Researchers consistently find that the more severe the abuse, the greater its impact on women's physical and mental health. And in addition to this, the negative health consequences can persist long after the abuse has stopped. Various studies have shown that there is a strong link between violence and a range of mental health problems, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, substance misuse, and the exacerbation of psychotic symptoms. So while we have a big mental health issue globally, we can trace it to, research has directly linked it to incidences of violence against women. Victims of domestic violence, they experience mental and emotional stress, which inhibits them from their normal functioning. When untreated, these conditions have negative lifelong impact on the victim and possibly their family. For example, research studies that have been conducted in Africa, they show that about 90% of women with substance use problems had experienced psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. So we see that violence that happens most of the time in the home and in the privacy of the home, it affects our society because now we have women who, to get the relief from the stresses and the mental health issues that they're experiencing because of violence, that may resort to substance abuse, which brings about another major problem to our society as a whole. And then we go and we look at the economic impact of violence against women. Violence against women and girls has a multidimensional effect on the overall health of an economy, both in the short and in the long term. And in the long term, the direct impact is that there is lessened productivity. As we know, and we have read in many studies that have been presented, that victims of violence, they are less likely to show up for work, especially after the immediate experience of violence. So when women are not showing up for work, it means that there is lessened productivity in the workplace, which affects companies, which affects communities and countries. And in the long run, when women are constantly and repeatedly experiencing violence, they may withdraw from the workforce altogether. They may withdraw from the workforce altogether. So, and when we're looking at the society level, that was just on the personal level. And then we're looking on the societal level. Violence against women is likely to limit poverty reduction efforts. For example, with what's happening in Sudan currently, women farmers in conflict areas in Sudan currently, they are facing intensifying violence that includes killing, injuries, and rape in armed military attacks while farming or fetching wood and water. So this results in this rise in violence has heightened the food insecurity for millions of women and women and children in Sudan as you speak. The conflict that is happening, it has resulted in increased food insecurity for the country because a lot of women can't even participate in the farming that they are most able, that they normally do because they get attacked by the military that is in that country. Domestic violence imposes a financial liability, not only for the victim, but to the state as well. The direct cost of the health system, of counseling and other related services, of the justice system, the cost of child and welfare support, as well as indirect costs such as the loss of wages, the productivity and potential, they are just a part of what society pays for the violence against women. So we pay whether we have experienced it ourselves or not, but as a society, we pay for the cost of violence. So it's everyone's responsibility to see it as our own problem. It's not a problem of just the victims, but everyone in the society needs to be awakened to the fact that we are all affected by violence against women, one way or another. Domestic violence cost a given economy between 1 to 2% of the GDP. And in Sudan, that's 2% of $34.3 billion, which is their current GDP. This is funding that could have gone to developing the education system, for example, creating jobs, for example, other developmental issues that the country so desperately needs. But they are being channeled towards fight against violence against women. So stopping violence against women, it's an undeniable moral imperative, but research shows that it's also economically important too. In conclusion, I just want to say violence against women is a clear barrier to sustainable development. Knowing the cost and impact of violence is remarkably powerful for understanding and for advocacy action to support women, to prevent abuse and punish perpetrators. Generally, much of the response to violence against women and girls to date has focused primarily on intervening with affected women after the violence has occurred. And such strategies are essential to mitigate the devastating effects for survivors, but they cannot prevent violence from occurring in the first place. There is therefore a need to implement programs that prevent such violence from occurring in the first place. And in doing so, we can prevent significant human rights violations and hold the promise of reducing the social and economic cost of violence in our communities and society. Thank you so much. I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you very much for that very high-level conversation around the impact of violence against women. And we know that this is the kind of impact that women who experience violence anywhere in the world will have very similar impacts that are actually imposed on them. And I think what I really take home is the fact that violence against women costs an economy a huge amount of money. The amount of money that can actually be used for peacekeeping. If we look at Sudan, for example, that can be used for key peacekeeping initiatives, but also could be used in initiatives that bring the voice of women on board in terms of how women participate in peacekeeping initiatives. I think the second take-home message for me is that unless we recognize the impact of violence against women, we're going to continue to have instability in countries, whether it's Sudan or in countries across the globe. So thank you very much for those very high-level conversation and conversations, I think, around how women in any situation feel the impact of violence against them. With that, I want to now look at some of the questions that have come through in the webinar chat. And I'd like to invite any of the panelists to respond to them. I'm going to take the first one that came through from Fiona Khan. And Fiona says that that violence against women and children are provoked in the Sudanese context. And her question is, what are international bodies? So may I please invite our panelists to respond to that? If one of you can start off the conversation and any of the others can add to it. Dr. Berry, would you like to begin?
Maybe Dr. Sandra, let her begin.
Yeah, I think the main problem is that all these situations have been taken for discussion by the international community, but we haven't got to stop what's happening in Sudan yet. And it's very difficult because every society has its own autodetermination, and we cannot start a new war to stop the previous conflicts that are taking place. So I'm not sure I could give a good answer for Fiona's question, because as you know, in the international arena, all countries have their own sovereignty. And I think what the United Nations try to do about sending peace missions and helping with food and health equipment and doctors, and that's what we've been doing. As Rushita, Dr. Berry mentioned, Indians' participation into these peace processes. Brazil has also sent women to help in these processes. Different research that the presence of other women in these peace missions has been very important to open for the possibility for women that are involved in these conflicts to get actual help. So Brazil has also sent women to these peace missions for the UN and has been contributing to these in this sense. I think if it was easy to give an answer, maybe we would have already stopped this violence that has been going on since the 50s in Sudan. My opinion, maybe, I don't know, informed opinion, is that we have to keep on trying the processes in the United Nations, in the women, peace and security agenda, trying to take the situation into discussion again and again, and maybe get the UN to send a peace mission or more people to help women in Sudan. That would be my opinion, but I know
Thank
this
you very
is
much,
Dr.
Paulson. Dr. Ruchira, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I mentioned in my talk, that the UN has basically called for stoppage of violence against women, but I'm not really sure how effective that is, because the warring parties are not listening to any international organization, regional organization, or even the domestic organizations at the moment. So So it is the safety of women in Sudan is really at stake here, and the situation is really distressful. But I think the international organizations can escalate it. They should not should not get disheartened by the current situation and continue to engage the warring parties in terms of having a dialogue with them, support the women in Sudan through the other means by sending aid. Hopefully the situation will improve and they would accept the international humanitarian aid that is being sent to the Sudanese people through various agencies, international agencies, and through bilateral means. I know that India has sent some humanitarian aid to the people in Sudan. So that could help in deflecting some of the problems that the Sudanese women are facing. But I think until and unless the international organizations take a stronger role in this matter, which is handicapped due to the sovereignty issues, as Dr. Sandra Paulson mentioned. So things may turn worse for women in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. Bukiwe, would you like to make a comment or would you pass on this one? Please unmute yourself. There we go.
I'll pass on this one, Prof. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
think the two speakers have engaged it enough.
Thank you very much, Bukiwe. So I want to quickly look at Fiona's next comment, and actually a very interesting input into the conversation, where she speaks about violence and violations against women in various parts of the world. And she literally, I mean, what she says is that in many instances, the perpetrators, there's no justice for women, and by the fact that men are not held accountable. But I think the final comment that she makes there is that men who are the perpetrators of violence against women, whether it's in conflict, non-conflict situations, are the ones who are actually making decisions for women. But I think it was Dr. Berry who said that women, the interventions that are actually designed at the local or within the country should be designed by the people who are actually affected. And I would assume that if women are affected in Sudan, then they should be part of the decision-making in terms of the solution. I know in South Africa, we have something really wise, where youth have said nothing for us without us. And I think that kind of slogan we can import into various contexts as well, and Sudan being a context that we are currently focusing on. So Fiona, thank you very much for that really important input. Sina Kikewa wants to know, what are some of the responses in place to mitigate and prevent violence against women and children during the ongoing conflict in Sudan? Bukiwe, do you want to take first bite of that, Perry? You're muted.
In Sudan specifically, currently, because of the crisis that is happening there, violence against women has not been prioritized. The fight against violence against women has not been prioritized. So there is not a lot happening on the ground in that country to fight violence against women. I think that is why Dr. Berry was saying that countries that especially around the world, that they should send aid, send help, and try to empower the people in Sudan, because in the country itself, there isn't much that is happening. Even the recording of incidences of violence, it's so minimal that there isn't a lot of data even coming out of Sudan of the incidences of violence, because it's still not a priority in that country to fight against. So there still isn't much work that is happening there to fight against violence against women.
Thank you very much, Bukiwe. Dr. Paulson and Dr. Ruchita would like to go next.
We can't hear you, Sandra, please.
Sorry. What I said is that I've been reading about the situation in Sudan, and I know that there are different women organizations that have been issuing manifests and protests, just protesting against the escalation of violence and trying to get information about what's going on, but also trying to get the international organizations, the international powers to intervene to stop the violence. But as we've been talking about, it's very difficult. You must somehow connect with the women's organization in Sudan to ask what is that they need and how can we help them for the best. I know that different Sudan Doctors for Human Rights, Global Fund for Women, there are very many different organizations, and even the Sudanese Women Rights Action trying to get help through. But I don't really know how in this acute situation right now, if our countries should take the issue in, for example, in the T20 summit in India, or even among the BRICS, to raise the issue so that we can raise the voice of the women in Sudan to get them to be heard. I guess that's one thing we could try to do.
Thank you very much for that insightful feedback, Dr. Paulson. Dr. Berry, would you like to give the last comment?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question. But again, as I said earlier, that it is an issue which is really dire, and the women in Sudan have taken initiative, as I mentioned in my presentation. One of the groups called Women Against Farm, which was formed immediately after the conflict took over. They were basically a WhatsApp group of women across, including across Sudan, including prominent advocates and human rights activists. They have been calling for, say, no to war. That's what they've been, chanting. And they've also, asking for immediate stop for violation against women and violation of women's human rights. This is what they have been arguing for, but I don't know how much the warring parties are listening to them and how much the armed forces are implementing in terms of their soldiers, whether they are really listening to what the women organizations are asking them to do. So because this is the situation is really very grim, and the fact that the war has got into people's homes, where people are being evicted from their homes, because it's an urban kind of warfare. People are being evicted from their homes, or if they continue to stay in the house along with, say, the paramilitary troops, then the security and the well-being of the women and girls within the family setup is really questionable, given the kind of situation they are in confined spaces. So the safety of women is really threatened in the current conflict. Sudan has over decades had various forms of conflicts, but this is the worst kind. This is the urban warfare, which is impacting not just the people in the rural area. I mean, in the past it has been in the rural area, but now it's an urban warfare impacting the people who are educated also. So this is a situation which is something which is unthought of in for people like us sitting in our peaceful rooms and having webinars. But for people within Sudan, women within Sudan, it is definitely a very grim situation. So I think the solution is very complex, and hopefully the views of the international organizations and the women in Sudan will be heard by the warring parties, and they'll come to the negotiable and end the conflict. I think until there is a movement towards ending the conflict, a movement towards political dialogue, this kind of situation may continue in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry, for that insightful feedback. I'm sure many of our participants feel empowered through that input that you've just given. I want to pose a couple of questions to our audience as well. The first one being that if we regard, hypothetically, if we regard women as an international community, regardless of where in the world we come from, what kind of support then do you think that we as international women can give to the women in Sudan during this particular crisis? It would be nice to hear some comment from the participants. My second question is, do we believe that NGOs can have an impact on mitigating violence against women in conflict zones? Those are the two questions that I'm posing to the audience, and I'm hoping that we can get some kind of response to that. But whilst our audience is still thinking through those questions, Thabo Nkabinde speaks about the legacy of violence against women in Sudan. And his question is, can the international, because it's a crime against humanity, he speaks about the fact that these atrocities in Sudan is a crime against humanity. Can the ICC or the International Criminal Court impose or charge these warring factions? Can they charge them with the crime against humanity? And that's from Thabo. I think a really interesting question that is. So can I put that back to our panelists if one of you would like to respond to that particular question? Can the ICC charge the perpetrators of this kind of violence?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Can we go to the ICC? Can the people in Sudan go to ICC, or can the neighboring countries or concerned individuals go to the ICC? I'm not really sure what is the procedure. I'm not a person who has looked. Maybe Nirmala, you would have more knowledge of that. But I think there exists the kind of crimes that are happening against women in Sudan does lead to an appeal being made, and at an international level, at some of the international organizations, whether it's ICC or not. then you'll have to name the individuals also, whether it is both parties or one party. We have seen the cases of former presidents of various countries in Africa, including the former president of Sudan, taken to ICC for his war crimes in Darfur and elsewhere in Sudan. So even the current political leadership or the military leadership can be taken to court, I think so. The possibility does exist.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Berry. I think you're spot on with that. They can do a class action also, but of course, anyone who's a perpetrator in these crimes against humanity, of course, they're complex issues and they're complex processes, but I don't think it discounts the fact that it can be taken to the ICC. But I'm not sure how how they would be sanctioned or how the sentencing or the remedy, what actual remedies would actually exist for them. Almahi Idris says, thanks a lot for your care about women's situation in Sudan during these hard circumstances. I am Mawat Ahmed Neil from Sudan, a political civic activist and a feminist. She says she's trying to follow, so I think she's just thanking everyone for this timely webinar. Comfort Tete says, thanks to the panelists for such insightful presentations. Violence against women in Sudan is worth discussing. Sudan being a patriarchal society deeply entrenched in culture where women are disadvantaged apart from the international affairs being pushed forward at the population or societal level, what other efforts are being done to influence or transform certain practices that will in the long run change the situation? And I think our panelists have already alluded to that. Amahi also says, after 60 days of war in Sudan, a very little effort is being done by the international community, as most of the international community and agencies left Sudan in a shameful way, which is all against the agreements and regulations. Thank you very much for alerting us to that. Fiona Khan says, Africa is only good for the resources. Nobody cares about the injustices faced by women. And Rwanda is a good example of how the world turned a blind eye, but ran to the assistance of Ukraine. And she adds her voice by saying that she believes that that racism is an added factor. There's other comments from the same participants, and Fiona asked whether we could have a recording of this particular webinar, and I think there is a YouTube video that will be accessible to all. So to the panelists, are there any other comments or any of the comments that I've read just now? Would you like to make a further comment to them or answer any of the questions? Please feel free to do that. We still have a few minutes that allows you to make some responses.
Just a comment from me, if I could go. As we have seen that there's this crisis in Sudan, and there isn't much that is happening within that country to solve the issue of violence against women. I think as the international community also, because we live in a global village, I think it's upon each member of society to take it upon themselves to make the noise about what is happening in Sudan. I think with social media, there's a platform that if we could all make the same noise at the same time, it will force governments, even the government in Sudan, to actually listen and take some action towards curbing violence against women. Because if we're silent, it's like it's acceptable around the world. But I think as individuals, we should use platforms, various platforms that we can use outside of Sudan, the international community. Use the platforms that we have available to us and make the noise about what is happening to women and girls in Sudan, and to force governments to play a role in alleviating what is happening there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bukiwa. I think that's a very wise suggestion, especially since we have social media and it has wide coverage. And I think that's a very valuable suggestion. Do we have Dr. Paulson? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Nimala and all other colleagues, I think one of the things we could do about the Sudan situation is exactly what you had the initiative to do right now, Nimala, calling this seminar so we could discuss and call the attention over the situation. Also, the suggestion of the previous speaker, Bukiwe, it was really important also what you said, that we should use the social network. I also think that it's important what this a participant of the seminar said, that she's herself a feminist activist in Sudan and she's trying to follow the seminar. I think the fact that we make this kind of events can also show some sign of hope for the women in Sudan, that we are worried about the situation, that it's not only that the international organizations might not have been doing enough, as she says in her comment, but that there are people listening and that may be following the suggestion of using social network. We could, from this seminar on, start with some hashtags and calling the attention for the situation in Sudan all over, through Twitter or whatever other networks we have or we use. As Professor Barry said before, of course, the situation is very acute, and as long as the conflicts continue, it's very difficult to do something if the two parts don't stop, at least for accepting the receiving the humanitarian help that might be available and things like that. But I would suggest that we continue having these conversations and webinars and using social networks to call the attention to this situation, because we cannot just accept that this goes on without ending. I know myself, I have personal acquaintances in Sudan, and I know that they have left the capital and they went to the rural areas for not being found by the different parts in conflict. So this is really a very acute situation, and maybe the social networks is the way that we could go on as a follow-up of this webinar. That I again thank you very much, Nirmala, for calling our attention to this. And I think we should continue discussing how we can help.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulson. I think very insightful feedback as well. Dr. Berry, do you want to make a comment as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nirmala, Professor Nirmala. I agree with what Dr. Sandra is proposing, that we should continue to engage through this medium, through this host another set of webinars. Since a number of questions were that what has been the response from the international organizations, for regional organizations, maybe, in some of the webinars that we plan, we can invite, if possible, someone from a regional organization to discuss this. Another way of going about this is to look at the lessons from other conflicts in Africa or any other parts of the world. How did they deal with the lessons, deal with violence against women? What were the roadmaps that they had used, and can they be applicable in the Sudanese case? So that could be another area of research and discussion and debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. I think, yes, learning lessons from previous conflict zones and how they were able to successfully navigate those difficult situations is a good idea moving forward as well. I'm looking at some of the other questions. Oh, sorry, Dr. Paulson, please go ahead. Please unmute.
I'm sorry, I'm very thankful for you to opening the mic for me to speak again. The thing is, I just forgot to mention something, and a question from an anonymous participant in our webinar chat, in the Q&A. He asked, what role do cultural norms and attitudes play in perpetuating violence against women in Sudan? And how can these be addressed? I just wanted to mention the role of education in all of our countries, because the role of openness to the rest of the world and the role of education in these processes. But again, as Professor Berry mentioned before, during the conflict, it's very difficult to take any measures, but the very first moment when we can get back to some peace or to some stop of the more acute conflicts in Sudan, education and information is probably the only way to stop this perpetuation of violence that we are seeing not only in the Sudan case, but even in other cases. I just wanted to use the word education here so it could be registered. That is the way we know has made a difference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulson. I think, yes, it's a tried and tested effort and intervention, education and awareness in terms of trying to mitigate some of the violence that's committed against women. I also want to, at this point, remind our audience that South Africa takes the role of women and violence against women very seriously. And as part of the BRICS academic forum, the issue of women was also showcased. So it's a very important theme, a very important discourse for South Africa. But the fact that we had a very good panel during the BRICS academic forum also shows the commitment of the various BRICS countries to the role of women. And I think part of the agenda is to advance the role of women, especially within our BRICS countries, but nothing stops us from expanding our support for women in our own regions. Having said that, and I think many of the questions, even in the Q&A, have in some way or the other been answered by our participants, I want to do something that's a little unorthodox, given that this is such a topical, this is so women, not just in Sudan, but across the globe is timely, but specifically the violence against women in Sudan. And something that I want to do that's quite unorthodox is I want to challenge our participants in forming a support group for women in Sudan. And the way in which, the shape and form can be decided on later, but to get a group of women and men who would like to, initiate, whether it's the social media platform or a webinar series, etc., that we form a group and we have continued conversations around how we would support or discuss what is going on in Sudan in terms of the violence against women. So if it's okay, Shakila, can we provide your email address for participants as well as our panelists to write to you to be part of the support group? And like I said, how we would do it, when we would do it, etc., will be discussed later on, but we form the support group and we start initiatives to show the women of Sudan that they are in our conscious thinking, and that we do feel for them, because we are, as men and women across the globe, we care about their welfare, and their safety. Please go ahead, Sandra.
Nirmala, I just wanted to thank you for this suggestion. I strongly support your suggestion, and I am very interested in participating in this continuing of support to Sudan. I'm also very sad to say that I have to leave you because I'm being waited at another webinar that is also an international webinar. And I just got a message here that they are waiting for me to start. So I just wanted to thank you very much, to thank you again for this initiative. And I am open for continuing the support to Sudan, and we keep in touch.
And on behalf of all the hosts of today's webinar, I want to say a huge thank you for your commitment. And I know that you were traveling, you didn't have enough time and space, but you made the time for this webinar, and also for your commitment to the ongoing interventions and conversations that we want to have around this topic. Thank you so much, Dr. Paulson. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You may
very much.
leave. It's fine.
I'm so sorry that I leave you now. Thank
We
you.
totally understand. Thank you.
Nirmala, I would also like to add my support to forming another discussion group on Sudan. The other aspect that I'd like to mention is that unfortunately, I have to be present in a physical meeting in Delhi, which is there is a major event on Africa, India-Africa partnership conclave happening in New Delhi as we are talking about it. So unfortunately, I'll also have to leave right now.
Dr. Berry, we cannot thank you enough. And I know busy people are usually the people that can give us really good ideas. So we would definitely excuse you, but thank you so much once again for your insightful participation, for giving us such good food for thought, and for committing to the future intervention and to taking up these discussions and conversations further. There are not many people who can give of themselves in the way that you and Sandra have just pledged. So thank you so much on behalf of all the hosts of this particular webinar. We will be in touch.
Thank you.
With that, I want to open up the floor for any further questions. Shakila, if you will allow participants to raise their hand, to unmute, raise their hand first, unmute, so we can hear their voices, we can see some of their faces, if that's okay with you, Shakila.
That's fine, Prof. Just there's a few questions in Q&A which we haven't answered as well. I don't know whether the participants want to respond to it directly. But if they raise their hands, I could unmute them, yes.
Sure, let's do that because there are a series of questions here, and I think some of them have already been answered by the panelists who have already taken their departure. But between Bukiwe and I, we will try to respond if the participants want to hear these questions, want to have their questions repeated. Can we please have them? Thank you.
Okay, there's no hands up at the moment. Doesn't look like there's any live questions, Prof.
All right. There's one by Danielle who asks students, I think it's the question, can students be involved in the struggles to stop violence against women? Dr. Daniel Alu, yes, of course. I think every person can be involved. And if you are asking whether we would like you to be part of this intervention group that we're having, we would really like you to be part of that, and other students as well. And I think it raises the level of awareness among students, and the youth voice is so critical in many of these discourses and conversations, especially in conversations that will help us to sustain livelihoods, that will help us sustain and mitigate against violence, whether it's against women or men in society generally. So the voices of students are extremely critical and important. And I really hope that we will have students who will participate in that support or intervention group. Are there any other questions? Or Bukiwe, do you want to answer
Just
any
the
of the
last-
questions? Sure.
I'm just saying that there is no comment, just a close up from me, Prof, to just thank you for creating and exposing us to such platforms where we can engage and we can learn with colleagues about issues that are happening in the world. And to just also express my interest in forming part of the support group that is suggested to be formed to fight against what is happening in Sudan. So I'm very interested, and thank you so much for creating such platforms. It's important.
You're most welcome, Bukiwe. And remember that unless we have people who want to commit to these processes, be successful. So I want to thank you for having been part of this conversation as well. There are some participants who are already pledging their support, and I think I'm very hopeful that even if we have a group of between 10 and 20 committed individuals, we will make some difference. And especially since Sudan is in our region, I think that's an important space to start with. With that, I want to hand us over to Ms. Xoliswa Zulu, who will now do the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. And good afternoon to our audience. I would just like to thank our speakers this afternoon, Drs. Berry and Paulson and Ms. Biela, for an engaging discussion this afternoon. Your talks have highlighted why women need to be part of solutions wherever there's conflict and violence against women and children. I hope that organizations that play a peace-building role, not only organizations from South Africa, but around the world, will finally recognize the role and power women play in building a peaceful and violent-free society. I'd also like to thank Shakila and Kurt for playing a huge role behind the scenes and to making sure that we're connected and that we don't have any issues while we're online. And to thank you, our audience, as well, for being so engaging during this webinar session. And lastly, to Professor Gopal for leading this today's program and giving us food for thought, and also creating a platform for all of us to engage on this timely topic. Thank you so much and enjoy your afternoon.
I think that's bye-bye from all of us. Thank you very much, everyone, until we meet you again.